All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming down on this very special night. We are live from Books and Books in Coral Gables, Florida, so a note to our internet audience watching at home. If at any time during the presentation you'd like to purchase a copy of tonight's book, you can just call the number on your screen. We'll take care of that for you. We will get it signed, and we will ship it to wherever you are in the United States free of charge. Also a note to you Books and Books fans out there, we have a new location in the Carnival Tower of the Adrienne Arsht Center for the Performing Arts downtown. We have a beautiful new restaurant and bookstore there, so please visit Books and Books at the Arsht. This evening, Books and Books is very happy to welcome back Mr. Gerald Posner, presenting his new book, God's Bankers, A History of Money and Power at the Vatican. And here to introduce Mr. Posner, we have a special guest. He is a local activist and a Miami Beach icon. Please welcome to the podium, Mr. Frank Del Vecchio.
Wow. Well, I thank you. You know Gerald Posner, he writes history, but they read like crime thrillers. You can't put them down. His unusual background probably destined him to write this book, God's Bankers. He was schooled by Jesuits at the St. Ignatius School in San Francisco. As a young New York lawyer, he spent 5 years pro bono on a lawsuit for the benefit of the victims of Nazi war criminal Joseph Mengele, the victims at Auschwitz. That spurred his first book, and there have been many since. He's a bestseller, A Case Closed, and Why America Slept. He's done everything. He's probed the Chinese mafia. He's uncovered the story which may implicate Saudi and 9/11. I even wrote a book about Miami, showing the dark underside of its glitz. Miami, Babylon, you know about that. His books have earned him a very wary following of nervous dictators and unhappy potentates. This one is already causing a stir, but he'll tell you about that. Gerald, where are you?
Unbelievable community activism for saving most of residential South Beach. If you think it's crowded now, you should see what it would be like if Frank hadn't been there doing the good fight. He's probably the only person I know that could have finished this book, God's Bankers, and taken it on as a mission and had the wherewithal to hold on for a long time. Thank you very much, Frank. It's great to see some familiar faces in here, some friends I haven't seen in a while. That to make the effort to come out to Coral Gables. I know it's not quite like living in Boston and making the effort to come out to a bookstore there tonight, but still, with everything, it's greatly appreciated. I know that half of you are probably here for not me or the book, but for Tricia Posner, who ends up being my indomitable partner on these projects. She's lived with a lot of different books over time. She's done every interview with me, save one on a 9/11 book, in which I didn't want her to know who the source was in case we got subpoenaed, and she was asked under oath who that source was. I wanted her to be able to look at somebody in the eye and say, I don't know, and not be lying. She is, although I'm Catholic, she was raised Jewish in London, and I think that she's just spent about enough time on and off since 2005 with the popes. She will be happy to bid them a farewell coming up very soon onto some project we don't know what's next. Also here are a couple of friends who have actually had a role in helping on the book. Chris Peterson, in this next to last role, is a very dear friend of mine from San Francisco. He was retired. He said, you know, I have extra time. And I said, great, maybe you could do a little bit of work on the book. And the next thing you know, he's involved in thousands of pages of documents and going through and creating indexes and being a proofreader of sorts. And he was a super help. Glenn Garvin from the Herald. Many of you read Glenn. You know Glenn. Glenn did me the favor of a cold read on this book. Went through and picked up some otherwise embarrassing errors before it was printed. I know now, it's astonishing Glenn, a Stanford graduate, was as good as he was on picking up those errors. But he did, and he has taught me forever that you can never say, as I said a number of times in the book, this cardinal or that pope passed away. Nobody passes away, they die. And I now know that. And in Glenn's inimitable way, what you're missing is his ability to call you up and say, you total complete idiot and fool. Don't you know anything about grammar? What do they teach you? What's the matter with you? After a few times you remember that. So thank you, Glenn. It was actually back in the late 80s that I had the idea that this book might come around, but I never imagined that it would be God's Bankers, the book that we have here today. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit this evening, very quickly, not take up that much time, the story about how this book happened. Back in '84, I was still representing a couple of twins from Auschwitz who had been experimented on by Joseph Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor. And I was doing a pro bono lawsuit against the Mengele family and against the German government. And as those of you who know me know I'm apt to do, I tend to be a little compulsive. So I did that work to the exclusion of most of the good things in the law firm. I had a very patient partner, the late Joseph Ferrara, who was remarkable on giving me the leeway to do that. And in the process of doing it, I was down in Argentina doing the research on Mengele, and because there had been rumors that Mengele had been there for a number of years. And sometimes what I discovered on that very, very first project, before it was ever a book, was the good reporting or good research is sometimes just the break of being lucky. The luck in that instance was that I happened to arrive in Argentina to ask about Mengele a few months after the Argentine military junta was thrown out of power in the war with the British over the Falklands. They had lost the war, the junta was out, in came a new civilian government, Alfonsine. I went to Casa Rosada, the presidential palace, I didn't know that then, or I might not have gone if I knew so many people had been told no, but Simon Wiesenthal, when he was still alive, the Nazi hunter, British and American investigators, Israeli investigators, all asking to see the Mengele file and all being told under the military junta, you got to be kidding, get lost. I applied at Casa Rosada to see the file, and they said, well, think about it. And I found a human rights advisor to the president, to Alfonsine. And I sat in a little hotel in Buenos Aires, the El Conquistador. It was then like $29 a night for almost the next 2 to 3 weeks, and it turned out that at one night at about 11 p.m., and Trish was back in New York at that time, they knocked on the door, and they were federal police officers. They had a blue Falcon outside, an unmarked car, which was a bad sign because that's the car they used to take the disappeared away in. And they said, come with us. And I managed to call her pre-cell phone at a time on the hotel phone to say, I'm going with the police down, leaving now. And where they took me was a federal police archive in which a very unhappy Argentine colonel had been ordered, obviously, by the civilian government to open up what was the equivalent of their Mengele file. And I was put into a side room, and there was a treasure trove of 10 years of Mengele's life. Everything from his entry into the government to his passports that he traveled on. It was a documentary treasure trove. And over on a table to the right were a whole bunch of other files, some of which I was able, in looking at those, you could see the files of Nazis who had arrived in Argentina, some of them with the blessing of a bishop in Rome, Bishop Udall, an Austrian, and some of them with Father Weber, who had been a very energetic priest who was helping to get Nazis south. There's also a file of Martin Bormann, the Hitler's deputy, which many people have speculated whether he was alive or dead. I asked foolishly, because it was the early part, I wasn't yet versed as a reporter to understand, never ask, just try to take the document and look at it until they slap your hand. But I said, could I see that? And they said no. that started a process of years of back and forth with the Argentines asking to see the Bormann file. They always said no. In '91, the New York Times allowed me to run an op-ed on the day that President Menem, then the Argentine president, was arriving in Washington to see Bush the Elder. And it said, free the files, in so many words, free the Bormann file. And the Argentines said, oh, he's a liar, that guy Posner, he's a two-bit liar, he's never even been in the files. And then they discovered I had been, and that started a process. Then the real heavy lifters came in, like the World Jewish Congress, like the Wiesenthal Center, and it took them 7 years to get the Argentines to appoint a government commission to release those files, which they did. I said to Tricia, there's a great story in here about Nazis down in South America and the connections to the church. We should look at it one day. And then we got waylaid along the way by things like Kennedy assassination, the King assassination, and things like that. And it took a long time to come back to this idea of, oh, let's look at World War II, the church. It's of interest for me as a Catholic, and the questions about Nazis. Found a publisher in Simon & Schuster that said, go ahead and do that. And for those of you who do write for a living, may find this somewhat unusual, but those of you who don't write for a living will think this is the way it's always done. Most of the time, somebody makes a book proposal to a publisher and they sell them on the idea of what the book will say. I always think that's the worst thing you can do. You need to talk about the topic you're investigating, but if you know your conclusion before you start, then you might as well not do your research. You don't need to do the reporting, because in the reporting you're going to find out where the facts take you. It may take you where you think. You have an inkling going in. If I'm doing a book about 9/11, I think it happened to be 4 planes and 20 hijackers. I think that's it. Now, I'll let the facts take me somewhere else if they do, but that's my bias going in. But you always have to be open to the evidence. So this idea of the Vatican book was World War II and the church, and Simon & Schuster said, great, go ahead and do it. And then as we got into it, I would say to Trish, well, you know, you can't really cover the war unless you go back a little bit earlier to when they became a country again, the Vatican. And so that's going to take us back to we should go back to 1933 first, when they acknowledged the Nazis. And then we roll it back to 1929 when Benito Mussolini and the Italian fascists recognized the church as a country. And I said, you know, some of these guys who were involved in the war, like Nogaro, the head of the bank, the financial wizard, he doesn't retire until 58. That's when Pius XII, the wartime pope, retires. Let's bring it to the late 50s. And then, of course, you realize in the late 50s, the whole Vatican Bank changes and they go on steroids, and they start to get involved with guys who end up under bridges hanging from a noose and fellows taking cyanide inside prison cells. And I said, my God, it's the cocaine cowboy days of the Vatican Bank. How can we leave that out? And then at one point, Tricia will say something like, you know, but how did they even start off in this, in the money world? And that took us back into the 1800s, where we realized, oh yeah, they never really liked the idea of capitalism in the first place, and they really used to think you should just have donations, send in a little bit in terms of Peter's pence, and kick in a little bit in terms of indulgences, buy a piece of paper that says, as a good Catholic, if you pay so much for this, you'll be forgiven your sins. If you pay a little bit more, you'll be forgiven some time in purgatory. If you pay a little bit more, your loved ones who died might get out of purgatory faster and go to heaven. As a great business, until it's not enough to pay the bills. And then they reluctantly embrace capitalism. And the next thing, we're looking at a 200-year history of the finances of the church. And history is one of those words that publishers hate you to use, because it normally means history, and they think, oh my God, people are going to say it's a history book. We don't want to read that. And we were very lucky with my editor and with having Simon & Schuster, because I submitted this book to them, and it was large, and had a ton of footnotes, and it had the word history in the subtitle, and there was like 2 weeks of silence because it took them that long to read it. And they got back and said, we like it. And it needs work, but we're going to go ahead with this. And they didn't take the notes and make it part of the internet. I've seen that done on books, where you have 500 pages published, and then you have to go up to the net if you want to see what note 32 is, which means nobody ever sees it. It's bad enough to have them in the book. And they let me keep the story large enough that I'm able to stand here today and say, I haven't covered everything, although I'd like to think I have. The thing I beat myself up with every night is the box of documents we missed somewhere. We found, for instance, a document in the National Archives that single document is what Chapter 11 is built around. Chapter 11 raises the question of whether the financial wizard, and we overuse the word in society, genius, innovator, but in this case, this guy was really extraordinary. Bernardino Nogaro was an Italian businessman who the Vatican tapped to run nearly $1 billion in today's money that Mussolini and the fascists paid them for having their loss of the Papal States, their empire. Because remember, there was a time in which the Pope wasn't just the Pope, he was a Pope king. He had a secular empire. He had 15,000 square miles of Italy, the Papal States. They ran an empire just like the French kings and the Spanish kings and the Brits. It was only when they lost that empire in 1870, when Italy became unified, that the Vatican was reduced to this postage stamp sized parcel of land that you could walk across 2/3 of a mile in 20 minutes if you're walking slowly. And that was it. And it lost its status as a sovereign country. So it went from empire and world's biggest religion to just world's biggest religion. Sounds pretty good unless you're used to the empire part. At the empire part, when they lost the empire, they had 700 members of the papal court. It rivaled the courts in terms of its size and luxury of any court around Europe. And for a long time, the popes used to marry. Those of you who've seen the Borgias on SHO know that. I mean, only in recent generations did they finally decide no women in the Vatican, or no women at least that were married to the popes. And so in that way of this financial wizard who comes in to take care of the money, in 1929, Mussolini comes to power. He comes to power 9 years earlier. Here's the fascist dictator of Italy. And the Pius XI says, hey, you know what? He is sort of anti-church, but he's Catholic at his core. And he is against abortion. And he is against, sort of premarital sex. And the fascists are on our board with all of the social issues. So maybe we can come to an accord with him. And they do an accord. They sign a deal with Mussolini in which they recognize Mussolini as the only leader of Italy. They throw their weight behind the fascists so that in every Italian home, I'm half Italian, I can say this, I used to remember my great-grandmother, there was at that time a little picture, there was a crucifix and a picture of Mussolini. They went hand in hand. And what did Mussolini give in return? He made Catholicism, he acknowledged it as the official religion not only of Italy, but he paid them money for the loss of the Papal States, it's nearly $1 billion, and he acknowledged him as a sovereign country and said the Pope has the same rights as a king. Now think of this for a second. Doing that, those of you who have been to Rome and been to Vatican City, you know it. It's this little parcel of land right inside the heart of Rome. That's why I call the Vatican Bank an offshore bank in the heart of Rome. There's no wall around the Vatican. You don't have to go through separate security or through a different immigration to get into the Vatican. You can walk in and out. It would be as if, it's not much bigger, Times Square from about 49th Street down to 42nd Street was its own country. So we said, okay, from 5th Street over to 7th, this is a separate nation. We didn't put any wall around it. But for the people who lived in the Times Square nation, if you lived outside by a block or two, and you had $1 million that you didn't want to pay tax on, or was illegal money, all you had to do is find somebody who lives inside the Times Square country, Vatican City, who happens to be a cleric, who can open up an account at the Vatican Bank where Italian tax authorities and investigators and drug investigators and no one can look at it because it's a sovereign nation. Have your money deposited in cash there. You don't have to send a wire transfer. Doesn't have to be followed. You can send it in truckloads of cash. You can send in gold. I raised issues about gold in American intelligence reports that may have arrived at the end of the war at the gates of St. Peter that were looted from the Croatian National Assembly from their national bank by war criminals fleeing then. Once you put it into the Vatican Bank, then it's safe. Nobody can follow it. You don't pay taxes on it. No one can follow an investigation there. And time again in this book, I show you how over a period of time, that is why the Vatican Bank became a safe haven for money launderers and mobsters, for politicians inside of Italy. Giuliano Andreotti, the most powerful post-war Italian politician, 7 times prime minister of the country, had slush funds inside the Vatican Bank. $60 million passed through one of them called the Foundation of Cardinal Spellman for doling out favors for everyone to his wife's jeweler to friends. This is how the Vatican Bank became embroiled with this. The power brokers went there inside of Italy. The money people went there who wanted to evade taxes. The mafia and the drug launderers went in there. Now, is that to say the Pope was overseeing a criminal syndicate and knew it? No. That's clear. There are people inside the bank that knew its power as an offshore bank of a sovereign nation, and they were clerics and they were bishops, and I talk about them, and some of them were indicted by the Italians, but they were never brought to justice because the Vatican refused to extradite them. Now, I'm coming all the way back to what I said I was going to say 10 minutes ago, which was the one chapter that was built on one document. I'd sometimes take a segue to the left or right. But we found a document in the National Archives about the fellow who runs the Vatican Bank, which got me distracted on the Vatican Bank, Bernardino Nogaro. And what it is from James Jesus Angleton, who some of you will know is the greatest spy, one of the greatest spy chiefs, counterterrorism chiefs, or the worst, depending on your view of him, and his efforts in the CIA to find a mole in the 70s and 80s. Angleton was then a young officer for counterintelligence, and he was interrogating a German officer who was head recruiter for the Abwehr, the German foreign intelligence inside of Italy. He has this guy, Wilhelm Karl Rem, draw up a chart of, as he knows it, what was the sort of the framework of German intelligence inside of Italy from 1943 when he was there on, and who were the people who were running the different divisions. And under one of them pops the name Nogaro. It's the first time the document's out. Nogaro, not an easy name to find. I then have a chapter as to why I think this is the same Nogaro. I'll give you the reasons why, where I think the Germans might have recruited him, that was running the Vatican Bank. And I can't say with any certainty that he was working for German intelligence, but that he was in contact with them seems absolutely the case. Knowing Nogaro, he was playing both sides of the field. So I wouldn't be surprised if he had also had a contact to American intelligence that didn't come out at the time. That entire chapter was built off of that document, which I think is a significant new discovery on the record. But what keeps me up at night is the fact that although we've looked through the National Archives and have spent out enough time there to camp out at times, that there's another document in some file in some dusty corner that isn't yet declassified that will give me the answer to that I haven't seen. That's what future investigators, historians, and researchers on this subject will do. And that is why, for any of you who have in the last week, I had an op-ed Sunday in the Los Angeles Times. There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal the other day. It's an issue that I never realized was an issue until the book was published, and that is, I can take you so far on this book, and then it stops. And what I mean by that is, I can cite counterintelligence corps officers who talk about the looted gold from Croatia and where it comes down to this seminary inside of Rome, and how then one of them thinks that it also goes over to St. Peter's. How the personal doctor for the previous Pope, Pius XI, had maybe $40 to $50 million of gold that may be sitting in the Vatican. His daughter was the mistress of Mussolini. There's a lot of nepotism here. It's Italy. But how long was that gold there? Where did they go on to? Did it help fund some of the people that I came across in South America in 1984 to get to South America for freedom? We don't know, because the answers are inside the Vatican. They have those files. Now, what about Nogaro, the Vatican Bank? In this book, there have been rumors for years. Many of you will have heard this. The question is, why did the wartime Pope, Pius XII, stay so silent during a time of the greatest civilian massacres? Defenders of Pius have published books about the fact that they think he made an effort. I have a chapter in detail about this. His effort was behind the scenes and was limited. He never spoke out openly about it, except for one Christmas message in which he had 22 words dedicated to it, never used the word Jews or Nazis. And the shame of it is, the church had better information about the Holocaust and the mass murder than anybody else on the planet, than any other organization. The Brits and Americans have nothing to have pride with. They had information by 42 and 43, and they didn't do anything. They turned the St. Louis away. So I know there's nothing. It's not as though I'm saying, the Vatican itself bears this burden. But I do know that the Vatican had reports from 1940 and on in details because of the fact that they had something the Americans and British didn't have. They had people in the field. In Poland, which fell to the Nazis in September of 1939, thousands of parish priests in every little village throughout Poland report back to the bishop what they hear and see on the ground. The Eitzung group and the mobile killing squads are out taking men from the fields, gypsies and Jews, shooting them. The word is getting back. The priests are reporting this back. It's going in diplomatic pouches back to the Secretary of State's office inside the Vatican, where Monsignor at the time meets every day with Pope Pius, who's a micromanaging pope. Montini, by the way, sidelight, becomes Pope Paul VI. And the information was there. In 1942, Hitler gives the seminal speech in January, for the elimination of the Jews, the final solution. He uses those words, that they have finally decided that all the ideas of kicking them out and sending them to work and everything else isn't going to work. In so many words, it's the final solution. It's the final elimination. The Jewish race will not return for 1,000 years. A couple of months later, an SS officer walks into the nuncio. The nuncio is an ambassador, the papal ambassador to Berlin, his office in Berlin. This SS officer wants to confess as a Catholic, confess that he has been involved in the killings in the East, because he just saw a killing in Lodz in which they used a makeshift gas container in a truck. They had hooked it up to a room, and dozens of Jews were crammed in, and it didn't work right. So he had to sit there with the other SS troops for an agonizing 3 hours while these people died. And it got so under his skin and under his conscience that he decides to go to the papal nuncio to confess it. He is intercepted at the front by the nuncio's assistant, who no one knows until after the war is a Nazi Party member secretly. He listens to the story and turns him away, never gets to the nuncio. He goes to another bishop inside of Berlin, and this time he tells the story. That bishop sends those documents of that confession in detail back to the Vatican, where they arrive by diplomatic pouch and by cable. They're there for the Pope and everyone else to see. And yet, the Church has a storied history of anti-Semitism. There were certainly people inside the Church that thought at some high levels, I'm not saying this was Pius the Pope, that this was divine will by God, this is what God had intended to happen. There was a fear that the Nazis might in fact move against the Vatican, might move against the Germans inside, who were Catholic inside of Germany, might move against the bishops and send them as well. It had happened in the neutral countries that a protest had resulted with the Nazis being even harder. So there's a number of reasons why people posit this happening. In 43, when the Germans come back within the view of Pius's window, they round up the oldest members of the oldest Jewish quarter in all of Europe, the ghetto in Rome, and march them on the way to what's going to be the Church makes no condemnation of that. The Germans were afraid they were going to, and 2 days later they're on their way to Auschwitz, where all but 3 of them end up dying. So this comes down to a question that's different for me, because I'm answering it in a different way. I don't look at the traditional ways of why the Pope may have been silent. For me, one of the reasons we don't do something in life, even if you're President of the United States or you're the Pope or you're confronted with this for one reason, you do it sometimes for a variety of reasons. So there could have been the fear of the Nazis moving against the Catholics in Germany. There could have been the fear that the Pope himself could be taken prisoner, that by speaking out he would only make it worse, and that Hitler would put the Holocaust on steroids and would have everybody dead 6 months earlier. But I posit in this book what I understand is controversial, but I also think it's accurate. The theory that money played a role, that in part the Church under Bismarck, predecessor to Hitler, had started to instill a 8 to 10% tax on German Catholics. So you made $20,000 a year, you had to pay $1,600 a year in tax. But guess what? It was voluntary. So you had to report it yourself. Say, I'm a Catholic, I pay it. Hitler hit a deal with the Vatican in 1933. No one had recognized Hitler's government as being legitimate. The first government to do it, the Vatican. What do they get in return? They get the Germans collecting this tax at the source. It becomes like a payroll tax. So now if you're a Catholic, you've been baptized, they know it. Unless you become an atheist or swear that you've converted to Judaism or become a Muslim, they're going to take 8 to 10% of your payroll every month when it's dished out by a company from Allianz or any other company, from Volkswagen, from Mercedes-Benz, and they sent it directly to the Vatican. In 1943, we don't have most of the figures, but in 43 I have the figures, $100 million at that time of money was coming from the tax to the Vatican. It was a major source of revenue. The Church had to be worried that if in fact they criticized the Germans and the Nazis for killing Jews and gypsies and others in Europe, they might lose that tax. But more than that, I set forth what I believe is the first evidence of how the Vatican did business with the Germans in World War II. And that is through German insurance companies in the killing fields of Europe, in Romania, in Croatia, in other countries in which they used Italian proxies, the very best friend of the financial wizard of the Vatican Bank, was a man he was a titan in Italian business. He was viewed as one of the most brilliant guys. He'd been a finance minister under Mussolini, and he was appointed to take care of Generali, Italy's biggest insurance company, when all the Jewish directors were kicked out. And then he went involved in Generali had more Jewish policies than anybody in all of Europe because it was a Jewish-run company that had made its livelihood on selling policies to Eastern European Jews. And then when the German Allianz and Deutsche Re and others, Munich Re and others, started to escheat the policies, which means that some clever businessmen sitting around said, hey, all these guys who have life insurance policies, they ended up at some death camp. They're never going to collect on this. Let's take the cash value of that policy now. That'll boost profits. And they started to do that late in the war. After the war, they did it for nearly a year. Those profits returned big profits to companies like the Vatican Bank that owned shares in those companies. Does it mean the Pope knew about it? No. Does it mean that Bernardino Nogaro knew about it? No, he just was looking at the numbers. Am I saying in this book that the Vatican did business with the Nazis and that's it? No. I'm saying they did business with everybody. We know, it's on the record, the extent to which they moved gold to America, in which they invested in American stocks. They bought real estate in London and some of the prime properties. Why should we think that a businessman running the Vatican Bank would make a decision to say, let's put all of our eggs in one basket? It's 1939. I think the Allies are going to win the war. I'm betting against Hitler. So let's only invest with the West. They invested on both sides. And until they saw where the war was going, in late 43 and 44, when it became clear that the war was going against the Germans, and then you start to see them unraveling the process of this intricate relationship. Last bit for you to think about. To me, sort of important, I think. When was the Vatican Bank formed? So remember I told you a little bit ago, the Vatican didn't really like capitalism. They came grudgingly kicking and screaming into it. And they went through correspondent banks. They didn't have a bank. They went through Chase Manhattan. They dealt with Barclays, and they even took loans in the early days in the 1800s from the Rothschilds, Europe's preeminent Jewish banking dynasty, much to the chagrin of many people inside the Vatican who thought that was just absolutely humiliating to have to take loans from the Rothschilds. The bank wasn't formed until June 27, 1942, right in the middle of World War II. Now that's interesting. Why do you need a bank in the middle of World War II? There's banks all over. You didn't need a bank for the first 1,950 years you were in existence. It's a 2,000-year-old institution. It's been a country. It's been an empire before. It never had the equivalent of a bank. It didn't have a central bank. It didn't have anything like an investment bank. But it's formed in the middle of the war because this financial wizard, he's good, Nogaro, convinces the Pope that it's going to be worthwhile. And the Pope becomes the only shareholder. It doesn't make loans. It doesn't give loans out because it's not a traditional bank, I should say. It doesn't have to turn a profit. It answers only the Pope. And the reason that Nogaro needed the bank is because the Americans and the British had the so-called blacklist. I go into this in the book. There's a chapter called The Blacklist in which they were looking for so-called neutral countries that were doing business with the Germans. And as a result of looking for them, all of these neutral countries in Europe were put eventually on the blacklist, and many of their companies, including Switzerland, little tiny countries like San Marino, Liechtenstein, Luxembourg, they all got blacklisted over time, and a string of their companies. Who didn't? The Vatican. There was a debate inside Treasury Department whether the Vatican should be blacklisted or not. And eventually they said, no, they're religious. They really won't take a side in the war. And Nogaro didn't. He made profits on both sides. But the mistake made was that 98% of the so-called bureaucracy of the Vatican, the Curia, the power brokers who ran the church at that time, were Italian. They had on the other side of Vatican City brothers or fathers who were serving in the Italian military, who were involved in Italian industry. Remember, to become a cardinal or a bishop back in the 30s or 40s, you just weren't somebody usually from a peasant family. You had some connections. It was an honorable thing for a family. Often the aristocratic families had a son who became a priest and then became a bishop and then became a cardinal. So they are entwined with the leading families of Italy. It was impossible for the Vatican to have remained neutral. It did not remain neutral, and I present some of the evidence of that in this book. After that, you're on your own. In the 60s, 70s, and 80s, all I'm telling you, there are some dead prosecutors, there are some murdered business titans. The book opens with somebody underneath a bridge in London who's hanging at the end of a rope as viewed as suicide, and later turns out, decades later, to have been a murder. Every time I think the Vatican Bank is going to reform itself, it goes through another period of scandal. So it goes through World War II, and then it looks like it's getting its act together, and then it goes through the great sort of what I call Sindona and Marcinkus and Calvi. These are businessmen and the bishop who ran it, scandals of the 70s. And in the 80s, they had to pay $250 million as a moral consideration to banks for a giant fraud, moral consideration. In the 90s and 2000s, everyone said it's reformed itself. And then we find out that it's a slush fund for at least politicians. I do think Francis is the real deal. I was skeptical when he took office in 2013 because he said the same thing all the popes say, oh, I'm going to reform it, and they never do. If he's there long enough, it's a big thing, he's 78, he can be pope long enough, his reforms can take hold. He's taken the reforms that could make this a transparent, boring, and mundane bank. It could work. He's got to change the bureaucracy underneath that likes to operate in the dark. And I've called on him. I sent a book to him with a cover letter that said, in so many words, Your Holiness, with all due respect, this is a history of the finances of the Vatican, but it's your history because you're the vicar of Christ on earth. You got elected in 2013. So I know you know it, but maybe you want to look at it just to remind yourself of how terrible it was so that you realize how important your reform efforts are. I don't know if you'll see it. But I have called on him, and I'm hoping that they will consider, before he comes to the U.S. in September, he's reforming the bank going forward. Great. But he can do something for everybody else going backwards. He can add a little bit of transparency on the documents still sitting inside the Vatican. He could release the entire archives and files of Pius XII, the wartime pope. They wait 75 years until after someone's become pope. He became pope in 39, so the first year was 2014. But it's in that time frame. He could release those. He could release the Holocaust-era files in general. Or what I've asked for is more specific and hopefully more doable, which is just release the Vatican Bank files related to business, looted gold, and insurance through the war. I'd be very happy to see those. And they will give us the additional questions. So if somebody disagrees with me, you don't think it's right, you think I went too far on saying that they worked through Italian proxies and took a share of what I call blood money in Eastern Europe, then let's see the documents and see what they say. And I think this is a pope who might do it. Might is the key word. And if that was the end result of all of this, then it would have been a long time well spent on a good subject. So thank you very much. I can't believe you guys actually came out. You're too great.
Folks, there are time for questions. If anyone has questions or comments for Mr. Posner, please feel free.
Yes.
Was it ever intended that any of the people who did these deposits were getting returns, or just getting their money safely and maybe even returned to them without returns returned?
The question is whether the people who were making the deposits in the Vatican Bank ever got returned, or whether they just were getting their money back was enough. In some cases, they earned no interest on their money. It was just because the money launderers used a fake thing called the foundations, so that these foundations exist. And the Catholic Church, by the way, is, to its credit, the largest charitable organization in the world. So they do spend a lot on charities, legitimate charities all over. That's how these illegal operations can exist. So they create a thing called the Foundation for Cardinal Spellman, and $30 or $40 million comes in 6 months, and the cleric running it says it's all cash donations. And they don't want to really check that closely because they're getting cash from countries that are, in the third world. They're getting cash from everywhere. It's a cash business. Donations come in that way. So sometimes these foundations, legitimate ones, get tens of millions of dollars in fundraising drives, and sometimes they're laundered. No return on the money at all. But in other cases, they were paying returns on Italians who were depositing the bishop, Archbishop Marcinkus, who's from Cicero, Illinois, was from Chicago. He's a character and a half. He's 6'3", 6'4". He had no background in finances, they picked him because he was loyal, and he ran the Vatican Bank. And his view was he ascribed to what Michele Sindona, an Italian businessman, said. There are two different types of illegal money. There's money that comes into the bank that's drug money and mafia money, that's no good. But there's money that comes in and it's legitimately earned by businessmen in their business. They just don't want to pay taxes on it. That's okay. So on that money, there was a return. So if you put in the Vatican Bank, you not only got the benefit of no taxes from the Italians, but you got the benefit of some return from Vatican as well. It was a win-win until they found out your name. Yes. Yes.
Yes, sir. The Catholic Church have made too many mistakes, and they have committed crimes and everything. This is the bad part of the Catholic Church. But there is one part that also is very good. They have great schools. They go to the jungle and they help the poor people. So the balance is very weird. It's more in the bad side than in the great side. And the thing that is bad in almost in every religion is that they teach you to fear God. Like God was a devil that is going to do something bad if you don't make money or do a contribution. So this is the bad part of it. Not only the Catholic, but almost every religion that I know.
It's interesting he says that, because I do have to say, okay, this is a history, it's 200-year history, and there are a lot of low points. But I say in the beginning, in the preface, I think this is really important, this book is not about religion. It's not about belief in God. It's not whether you think Jesus Christ is the Savior or not. This is a story about men and money, and in the end, what they prove is that these men are as fallible as the rest of us. They're mortal. They're not infallible. What happens inside a dark bank with no oversight is what you'd expect to find out if billions of dollars are going through. So it's not that it's unusual. It happens to be that it's in the Catholic Church, and we say, oh, how could that have happened? But in essence, it's human nature. And all I'm doing is shining a light on that. But I agree with you. Church has done fantastic things. I stand here. Somebody said to me recently, this is an anti-Catholic book. I said, well, then it's anti-me. I'm Catholic. It's my history. It's a history, but it's also my history as a Catholic. So if I'm doing a history of Germany, as a German, I can't leave out World War II, even though I might want to. If I'm doing a history of the British royal family, I can't leave out Henry VIII and chopping off the heads of his wives. So you have to tell the history as it is. And the good note is, although some people may think that, and it's not just Pollyannish, but I do think it ends on the good note of Francis. If we had finished this book in 5 years and published under Benedict, the previous pope, I would not be nearly as hopeful. Benedict was well-intentioned, but was incapable. That's one of the reasons he resigned. He was overwhelmed by everything. He was good at every position except for pope. So Francis gives me a bit more hope. Yes, Sydney.
Yeah, hi, Joe. You know, I was raised as a Catholic, and I agree with you. The Catholic Church has a lot of contradictions. Like when I was growing up, they would always hand out these big baskets with these long hooks where we had to give all of our money, and I was taught if you give up all your money, you give up all your success, you're going to go to heaven. If you don't, you're going to go to hell, because you're rich. But yet they were living the good life. I fell off me. So it's like it was kind of, and they also practice, they also say, yeah, you should take the vow of chastity when you join, like the nuns and the priests. But at the same time, they have when I went to Rome, I saw all this gold, these expensive paintings. It was complete contradiction of what I was taught as a kid. It's like we as a people, we were taught to take the vow of chastity and to give up your wealth and your riches, but yet we were given them riches.
I think that
I was confused about that.
I think that Francis really is a real old line Jesuit. Had the Jesuit for 4 years, believer in the old way of distribution of inequality of poor and rich. He's going to come in September here and make a lot of people on Wall Street uncomfortable, because he's always saying things like, a homeless person dies in the street and it's no news, and the stock market goes down 200 points and it's on the news. So why the difference? And so he's preaching that to a different way. There is a part, one very quick sidelight, in the book of one of my favorite things in the early 1979, 78, 79 in Philadelphia, in Doylestown outside, the Pauline monks. There was a group that was running this Polish shrine, a lady of Czestochowa. I love every time I say that. Somebody in Poland grimaces because I mangle that word so badly. and they had gone through like $20 million in contributions. They had got $400,000 to give bronze plaques on these memorials. They just kept the money and spent it and didn't put up the plaques. They got $250,000 to say masses. They just spent the money. When eventually they bought a local cemetery and they leased it out to a gas station. And when the local cardinal came in and said, "You guys have to give up your high-end stereos and cars and all this," some of them left the order. It was an amazing moment. And the reason it's in the book is because the new pope at this time, when all this is hitting the fan and there are lawsuits by parishioners saying we want our money back, the bonds are useless and everything else, we're unsecured, Cardinal Kroll in Philadelphia was trying to deal with it all. The new pope was a Polish pope. John Paul II had just come in, Cardinal Wojtyła from Krakow. And he knew these prelates. He knew the Father Rennet, who then made an appeal to him, and he used the Vatican Bank to send several $1 million to Philadelphia to quiet the whole process up. And it's a great part of the story when you come in and you say, okay, money does buy things sometimes. It buys silence in this case. Yes. Oh, Joy. Joy, thank you for coming.
I'm happy to be here. After you send the book to Pope Francis, have you had any response at all back?
No, although he's an unpredictable pope, in that he sometimes calls people up, that have and leaves a voice message on the machine or that. There's a Spanish case in which the prosecutors just decided in Spain, some of you may have seen recently, not to indict 9 out of 10 priests who they thought were going to be charged with pedophilia, sex abuse crimes. Their statute of limitations had passed. One of those victims had written a letter to the Pope last year, and in November, October, the Pope called him up and said, we're going to do our best to get into it. It would be like, complaining to Apple about your phone not getting good Wi-Fi connections, and Cook calls you up, and wants to know if he can help you out. So he's unusual in that way. I applied to get access to the secret archives. You can get access to the archives if the Vatican looks at your resume and says you're a serious historian. Some Catholic historians have gotten access to the archives for very specific purposes. They've done releases of documents, some of them related to World War II. There's an 11 series set about World War II documents. Not everything, just what the Vatican sort of thought it should be out. They said no to me on that. But they went through a process. The bishop in Miami sent a letter on my behalf recommending that I get access to the archives, Bishop Wensky, and it was very nice. And then it went to the ambassador in Washington, who's the nuncio, and he looked at Bishop Wensky's endorsement and said, "Oh, I agree as well," and sent it on to Bishop Pagano, who's head of the secret archives, who sort of said, "You got to be kidding." But so I didn't get in. And in the many interviews I wanted to get, the Vatican just ignored those. That I'm not completely surprised. Because it is such an old institution, their view is often waited out. We survived the Huns. We survived the ransackings of Rome. Napoleon took the Pope back to France as a prisoner. We survived Hitler, and we're still doing okay. So somebody has a book out and is asking for some files from the Vatican, just stay low, and it'll all go away. Maybe they're right. Yes?
Were there any Americans involved with the Vatican Bank where investments from the USA were made into the Vatican Bank? And if so, like with Switzerland, could the IRS possibly investigate the books of the Vatican Bank to see if there were income tax paid, something along that line?
Yeah, well, that question will send shudders through the Vatican, just that very question. The IRS could, of course, but it will be tough to get those records. There aren't many Americans that were using it. The Vatican Bank became a repository really for Europeans, Italians first and foremost. But then if you had a connection, and what I mean by a connection, you had to have an in with a cleric in your country that had some influence. So friends of Francis Spellman, the Cardinal of New York, friends like Jack Kennedy or Richard Nixon or others, they had sway, they could do it. Friends of the Vatican Bank came this way with money, so that Nicola Sindona, who was a big investor who ends up dying in a jail cell of a cyanide capsule, and the Italians say it's suicide, he's involved in business dealings with the Vatican Bank, and he comes here on Nixon's re-election campaign, and he calls up Maurice Stans, who's then running the re-election campaign, and says, "I want to make $1 million contribution in cash, like now." And it's 5 days before the election. It was too late to make the contribution. He wasn't a U.S. citizen. He couldn't make it for a whole host of reasons. Stans was smart enough to say no, or it would have been a hell of a thing. But we don't know where that money was coming from. So they came this way instead, trying to buy parts of America. Yes?
Also, too, is it true that the Catholic Church, well, these priests were involved in giving money, funding the Nazis? I heard that's true.
Yeah, it's not so much funding the Nazis as they did business with them. They made money from the Germans, right? And and I think that is a different part of the moral equation in that sense. And by the way, I know that in Miami it's been an issue, and it has been in a number of American cities. There's a chapter in here on what I call the sex abuse crisis. It's been covered very well in other books by Jason Berry, other writers who have done a fantastic job on this. I don't cover it in terms of the sex abuse crisis itself, in terms of unfolding what happened, but I view it again from a money perspective. What was the Vatican doing? What was the Vatican Bank doing while all these stories of sex abuse were playing out? What they were doing in Rome was saying, oh, let's make sure that if these, first they think it's only a problem in America, these American priests, then they find out it's Ireland, it's Australia, it's everywhere, it's international. But if these American priests have really done something wrong, let's make sure it can't come against us. That some crazy American lawyer sues the priest and they get a judgment and they come and sue the Vatican. So the lawyers get involved and they insulate every diocese from each other so that if one diocese goes under, it can't take down the rich diocese next to it. So 11 dioceses have gone bankrupt. They haven't taken down the diocese. And then to the Pope's great fear, they did get sued. Good, clever American litigators said, hey, he's only the Pope, we can sue him. So they sued, and that went through the courts for about 6 or 7 years, nail-biting time in the Vatican that they might get a judgment against them, a default judgment in the States or that, and then have property seized that belonged to the Holy See. Eventually it was dismissed. They said, you can't sue the Pope. He's a sovereign of a foreign country. Come on, learn the lesson. So they threw those suits out and they dodged the bullet. Yes?
I'm just a general reader, but your book was the first book that really showed me the wrong that was committed, because you always hear it's wrong, but instances, for example, of the Jews in the Roman ghetto that collect the gold to pay the Nazis, and they're not sure they have the gold, and then they ask for a loan, and then they said to the bank, no, we have it, and then they get sent to concentration camp anyway. That really is, there is no justification for that. I was going to ask you, the money from the insurance companies, that was a big plunder. Any of that was recovered?
Yes.
Given to the victims?
And
then also the younger Germans had to pay war reparations. Has there been any movement saying, why we? Why don't we go to the source? Those that did the direct plundering. I just don't know that part of it.
Yeah, no, there's a chapter I have called Burying the Nazi Past, and what it is about in the 1990s, this issue explodes again about reparations, and it just happens to be, it's a confluence of events. As you couldn't have planned it, it's the serendipity that a number of victims groups are trying to ask the Germans and insurance companies and manufacturers and car manufacturers who use slave labor in the death camps for reparations, and they're asking the Swiss banks for it. And Clinton was president, and he issued a directive. He put a guy at the State Department, an assistant deputy of state, Stuart Eisenstadt, to do a report. It's a fantastic report about how things were looted in the war. And the U.S. government started a process of releasing its wartime files on this subject and encouraged other countries to do it. Madeleine Albright was Secretary of State. Over a period of time, when countries met, including the Vatican, against its great resistance. The Vatican said, we don't want to send representatives to these meetings. We had nothing to do with this. And Clinton and others sort of beat them up a little bit. I say it nicer in the book, but they did, to say you've got to have representatives there, full representatives. And they did send representatives to these meetings. In the end, every country, including Russia, reluctantly, Russia came in at the end and finally opened up its files after 2, 3, 4 years. They did reparations, lawsuits were filed. The Swiss banks hit the largest, I think, number at history at that time. It was like $2 billion paid out for victims. Then a bigger reparations number came from the insurance companies, including Generali and others that the Vatican had stakes in. The Vatican never paid a cent because its official position has been, we didn't profit from this. These companies did. They used slave labor. They made profits on it. My I suggest they were invested in some of these companies. So now we come to the crux of this issue. When I said before, I hope that Francis will release the files, there will be a very strong contingent inside the Vatican that says, don't do it because you can create liability. It's a dollar and cents things. The same people were demanding reparation in the 90s from German insurance companies. If they see you had a role in Generali, an investment role, they'll be demanding money from the Vatican. And that, I think, may scare the Vatican to keep those those files, unfortunately, quiet.
One more question. You said the Vatican Bank started hedging itself when they saw that the Nazis weren't going to win the war. So far you've mentioned the Axis powers as being big investors, the Italians and the Germans. On the other side, they're hedging themselves now. Who were the big investors from Europe? The French? The English? You said it wasn't the U.S. Who were the big investors on the side that won the war?
It wasn't the English, because the English were really out of it. The other investors who are making money with the Vatican at this time are the Swiss. The Swiss are all over them. They're like, they become brothers very, very quickly. Luxembourg, little Luxembourg in the Vatican. There's more traffic going back and forth between those two countries you can imagine. The head of the Vatican Bank is establishing his first offshore companies in Luxembourg, then moving into Liechtenstein, moving gold around. It's what I call the, for lack of a better word, the shady group of neutrals. They're really the ones doing business. But in the end, Switzerland was the nexus. Everything passed through Switzerland, including the Dulles brothers, who were set up, running in Switzerland. BIS, which is the Bank for International Settlements, was an operation that continued operating through the war, even though it had some Germans on its board. But it was firmly under the control of Schroeder and these German bankers through the war. It's still in existence today. In the Allied invasion in North Africa, some directors, Vichy directors on BIS, on the Bank for International Settlements, get a tip from the Vatican's espionage unit. Yeah, you can't make this stuff up. They did have an espionage unit, such as it was, clerics who passed along information. They get a tip from the espionage unit that the invasion's about to take place. And these guys at BIS say, oh, they're going to invade. You know what? We should probably sell the Reichsmark short. I bet that'll batter the hell out of the German Reichsmark once people see the Allies are invading. So they go and they do gold transactions in Turkey, where no one can see it, to take a position against the Reichsmark. And when the invasion takes place, they pocket like $120 million in today's money. It's fabulous stuff.
Gerald, this might seem like a simple question, but pretty much the Catholic Church as a whole have made all their money off the poor, for the most part, correct?
But they've given it back to the poor as well. So it works both ways. I have to say, I think also a lot of the money, Sydney, has not just come from the poor, but there have been people that buy the equivalent in the old days of titles. So if you gave a big enough donation to the church, you became a marquis or things like that. As a matter of fact, the Mellon family, which are Protestant, gave so much money to the Vatican and helped them so much, they got even Roman Catholic titles. So it was fantastic. It showed you didn't have to just be Catholic to get the title. So I think it's both. To their credit, poor people contribute to the church. No question. Sometimes more than I think they should, because they're not making that much. They can barely keep their family going. But on the other hand, the church, there's Oscar Romero is an El Salvadorian priest. Some of you may know, recently was in the press. He was killed, and I think in '83, he was killed at his altar by soldiers from the right-wing government. And he was involved very heavily in liberation theology, which was sort of the theology of the people, and the Reagan administration viewed it as Marxism. And it's a mixture of Marxism and theology. I mention him because there's a movement in El Salvador for years to bring him to sainthood, and that was resisted very strongly by John Paul II, the Polish Pope. He said, no, he's a Marxist, not a saint, and by Benedict. And Francis just announced a few days ago he's moving him to sainthood. So I'm not saying that the whole thing is suddenly la-la land and better, but I think the message is going to be more toward the poor and not just lip service. I think Francis can deliver that, and that's exactly why he makes some of the old traditionalists in Vatican City so nervous.
What about the four nuns that were raped and killed in El Salvador in 1980? What was that?
Those Maryknoll nuns, I talk about them, as a matter of fact, it's very interesting, because at the time that was done, the church was doing something. In that period, John Paul, who was the Pope, had formed, he became Pope 5 months before Margaret Thatcher became the Prime Minister of England, 2 years before Ronald Reagan became the president. When Thatcher and Reagan are in office, they have a like-minded anti-communist Pope who comes from a communist country in Poland, and together they formed one of the great post-war alliances. The head of the CIA kept going over to see the Pope. He supplied them information from the priests on the ground, the same types of priests who a generation earlier would have seen the Nazi crimes committed. They shared this information. Money passed to the Vatican Bank. I have an incident in my book for the first time about a SUV that's filled with $3.3 million in gold ingots from a Swiss bank and the false sides of a car on the SUV, and on the bottom, and a priest drives it from Rome to Danansk to feed the Solidarity movement to topple the communists. So that alliance meant that even when the 4 Marian nuns were killed, the church paused to say that's terrible, but kept its alliance going to crush communism. And that ideological alliance is gone now. Definitely gone. Yes. Okay. Last question?
Yes, please, last question.
Why do you think that this Pope or any other Pope would open these files and expose himself or the Catholic Church to all it?
Steve asked a great question. Why would this Pope open the files and expose the church to this? This is the great thing. Glenn Garvin, as a reporter, anybody who's a reporter will understand, the great part of governments is that they hold on to stuff for decades and decades or 100 years, and eventually somebody gets far enough from the time, they say, oh yeah, we can open those up. And when they do, it's fantastic. You do see, I got from a Freedom of Information request in 1981 to the Army documents which showed that Joseph Mengele had been captured twice by American troops and mistakenly released. It was fantastic. I didn't do anything clever except write the note for the FOIA request. They released them on that stage. So sometimes governments purge themselves of information. I think the only thing that could make Francis focus on it is if it becomes an issue where people are asking him, saying, you're the person that can change this. You should be the person to start the process. And I don't mean they open the doors and we all rush in and start going through them. I mean, it's a process of declassifying them, the essence of declassifying, going through them, marking off the things they don't want to, but start a process where we know it's going to trickle out for the next number of years. And that could happen. All right. Thank you very much for coming.
All right, folks, if there are no more questions, we have books for sale on both counters. Gerald is actually going to be signing over on the west side of the store, on the other side of the building. We are going to have a nice food and wine reception set up over there. So books are for sale at both counters. I want to thank our guest introducer, Frank Del Vecchio, and please give Gerald Posner another hand. Thanks very much.